Hello! Welcome to another day of the Internet Measurement Village. Joining us today, we're so glad to have Andrés Azpúrua from Venezuela VEsinFiltro. And today he'll be telling us about internet censorship, DNS poisoning, and phishing in Venezuela. Thanks for joining us, Andrés.
Thank you, Arturo. So, yeah, this is what we're going to talk. Internet censorship, DNS poisoning, and phishing in Venezuela, as Arturo just said. And we're also going to talk how we measure that, how we collect this data, and some significant conclusions we have gathered from that work. So, most of our work can be seen at VEsinFiltro.com or at VEsinFiltro on Twitter. On Twitter, we tend to post almost real-time reports of censorship, especially of the most significant internet platforms. And on VEsinFiltro.com, you can see all of reporting on alerts that are in a more written down, calm fashion. Before we start, I'm going to give some quick tips on Venezuelan context, so things are more clear when we talk about it. We have a critical failure of public services, which go all the way from stuff like water and electricity to services such as the internet. The problems in the electric distribution are so bad that electric blackouts are really common, and they usually mean complete disconnection of cities and states, hours, sometimes even days at a time. If there was a national blackout that lasted several days in 2019, and even during that crisis, with basically the national government unable to work normally because nothing had power for days on end, even then we saw new cases of internet censorship. And the state of the internet in Venezuela is complicated. So we have a state-owned ISP that has a seriously dominant share of residential internet access. Over 80% of residential interconnections are by this state-owned ISP called CAMTV. We have a decreasing residential internet penetration. So the amount of people who have actually internet in their homes have been decreasing for the last few years, and it's on a depressing low at this moment. We have 3 mobile operators. Average download speeds, depending on the source, come around 1 megabit to 2.8 megabit, and this is the average interconnections. When you see average interconnections this low, usually means that you have small percentages of internet users that have really fast internet connections, and they skew the average towards the faster end. But in our case, you'd see a huge amount of Venezuelan users who have internet connections that are slower than 1 megabit download. Unfortunately, we're talking about internet connections that are so small or so slow that most providers of this information don't have breakpoints to see how many people are connected below 1 megabit or between 1 megabit and 2 megabits. We have around 46% of residential internet access, and we have a fragile infrastructure, as I mentioned. And when the power goes out, you lose both your power for your laptop, for your router. Most internet services go down, including mobile phone service, which don't tend to have enough batteries or generators to continue working when a blackout comes. We also see all kinds of digital attacks and persecution of online speech. For one example, this Twitter user, Aerometeo, was detained unlawfully for a whole year because of this tweet. This tweet includes information about the Venezuelan presidential plane flying over parts of the country, and he was just showing a picture of this website, Flight Radar 24, which is an open website that basically shows the information of all our planes that are showing their location through transporters. This is publicly available information, but because this was a flight of the of the Venezuelan president, then he was detained for a whole year just to showing information that was publicly accessible on a website. So now we go into subject, starting with internet censorship. I'm going to make some clarifications just to make sure that we are on the same page. We use two terms that some other sources might use it interchangeably, but we use with a specific meaning. First case is when one or more related websites or services are being blocked for a specific reason. So let's say Twitter and YouTube, or Twitter and Facebook are blocked for the same reason at the same time. We tend to consider those as the same case. The relationship here is that they both serve the same purpose. As a social media platform where, for example, people might be sharing pictures of a protest, and that we consider a single case some of the time. And of course, the boundaries between making that one case or two cases might be fuzzy sometimes, but that's a distinction that we make it separate. And event is the continuous block of a specific target by one ISP. So if the same site is being blocked by two different ISPs, we consider that two different events. If one site or service is blocked, then unblocked, and then blocked again, that's two different events. We also have two more names that we assign to two more categories that we assign to different kinds of block. First is indefinite block, which is basically most blocks you see online, both in Venezuela and overall. In our case, we see long-lasting blocks. Sometimes they last for many years. Some have been since the beginning of internet censorship in Venezuela. They usually come through orders from the telecom regulator. You can see them in all or most major ISPs. You can see them targeting big and small websites, and there's no clear end to them, hence indefinite. But we also see a different kind of internet blocks that we call tactical, and we have tried to test the different possibilities to name them, and tactical is the one that people in Venezuela understood its meaning better. Tactical blocks are as short as possible. They come just in time to silence an event, such as a protest, a public speech, or a press conference. And they try to balance the political cost of blocking some high traffic sites with their need to actually censor or silence that event, and how long can they do it. We see them only on state-owned ISPs, so CanTV and their daughter companies. And these kinds of blocks happen to major online platforms such as YouTube. So YouTube is such a basic platform that is used both by the government and the opposition, as used as basically anyone doing most things in the internet, from education to entertainment, and has such a political cost to block YouTube and other such platforms, including Twitter and so on, that they do it for a shorter period as possible, just to balance the political cost of doing this block, and also the operational cost, because even their own state-owned media platforms use YouTube to distribute their content sometimes. In general, we measure things with a mixture of some off-the-shelf probes with custom settings. So these are small computers that run on Linux, and we use OONI currently with the legacy command line interface and some custom scripts. We also use OONI run links, so we go into OONI run and create those links, and occasionally use RIPE Atlas. We also do manual testing and we capture package for more in-depth information when we need it. So OONI run links for us are fundamental to get multiple measurements really fast, especially from places we might not have probes. We also use it to bridge any gaps that we might have at the moment. And it has a faster turnaround to get measurements out. It might be slower to get the actual data from it or cumbersome, but sometimes all we need is, in a short window of time, get as many measurements as possible. And for that, going to run the OONI.io, getting a link, and distributing it is the best option that we have. We also have measurement probes that, as I mentioned, and we use them just mostly to guarantee that we have more data points of the whole list of possible blocked websites. We can increase the test frequency to specific lists so that they have more data points. In our using, we have alternate lists and alternate settings so that we have different lists depending on their priority and which test we want to make. We also have high intensity DNS, TCP, and HTTP host and SNI based filtering scripts that we use to get really short time windows to see exactly when something starts blocking. So sometimes we can tell with a window of seconds or less when a block started, and have specific scripts just to get that really high temporal definition, so that we know exactly when it happened and when it ended. And block rates, because some blocks implemented in Venezuela have limited capacity, and the block rate is not 100%. And for those, we also have some scripts that help us understand, for example, this block has a 80% success rate or an 80% block rate. And for having this, you can't just test whether it was blocked or not and take the measurements at face value. You have to repeat a measurement multiple times and see the frequency in as short of a window as possible to see a snapshot of the block rate at that moment. We're currently migrating our measurement probes from to a different version, which we will make available so that others can use a very similar OS image and capture their own information they care about and contribute that to the OONI Explorer. We'll also use Atlas probes, not so much that we have a lot of them, but mostly use the ones that are already installed, and we use them to get a different kind of measurements and also to record some changes from the vantage point from inside of different Venezuelan networks. So the most common kind of block in Venezuela is the DNS block, which happens when this is going on. When your computer wants to connect to the domain, it asks for its address, its IP address, which is a series of numbers. And usually your ISP, your internet service provider, gives you that answer. And then with that information, your computer is able to connect to the server it wants. Because in the internet, traffic doesn't flow with domain names. The names are there just for us, for humans. But in the end, as we all know, it's IP addresses, which are used to actually route traffic over the internet. So when we see a DNS block, we see something like this. And just the state-owned ISP or whichever ISP will not give you the correct answer, and without it, you don't know the IP address, and thus you can't connect to the actual server you want. This is how this looks typically on most mainstream ISPs in Venezuela. So CanTV, Supercable, Digitel, Movistar will give you a server failure response, which doesn't include, obviously, the actual IP address. And Inter, a different cable modem ISP, it'll give you a look-back address. We also see TCP blocks. And TCP blocks basically impede the creation of a TCP handshake, even though you might have access to ping. So if you're familiar with ping, you can ping those servers and you can connect to them, but you won't be able to establish a TCP connection, and thus you won't be able to exchange data over for the web, for example, or for most services that we use. The DNS blocks, we see them in all ISPs, and is by far the most common. In contrast TCP blocks was largely deprecated until 2019 when they reemerged, basically used to block YouTube. We see a lot of evidence of misconfiguration of the TCP blocking tooling that they used, because we saw how some of the IP addresses used to block YouTube from time to time were left in block state, and then even when they were not trying to block YouTube, some IP addresses were blocked, and when they did indeed try to block YouTube, sometimes some IP addresses were available, and then they noticed it. We also saw a lot of experimentation at that time on how to successfully block YouTube, and basically they had a list of IP addresses that they were impeding TCP blocks, and that's why frequently when Venezuelan users experimented YouTube blocks, a lot of YouTube services also went down. So you would see sometimes, rarely, you see Google search going down, but basically every single time YouTube went down, you would see a failure of most other Google services, including Calendar, Chat, Hangouts, Meet, Google Drive, and Google Docs. This also affected those. A lot of people working without any relationship with the political crisis, and you would see a lot of people being affected by this. And we also see HTTP blocks, or application layer blocks, which basically work when you have something very actively looking into what's being transferred on the networks, and try to find out which service you're requesting. So if they see you're requesting a service that they want to block, regardless of the IP address you're asking for, then they'll notice this, and they will stop that communication happening, especially the initial handshake between your computer or your cell phone and the server, and they'll just drop those packages. That information will be dropped, and then it will be, no connection will be made, and your computer will be trying to continue until they give up. And you see, for example, on Chrome, you see like the dinosaur, because the computer was like stopped trying to connect because something was impeding that connection. So we see on this category, we see both HTTP host and SNI filtering. So for HTTP, it looks which host you're requesting, and for HTTPS, which is encrypted, and the sensors cannot see the actual content of the communication, they still see when you're asking for which server you're connecting on that idea. That's called the SNI, or server name identification, and that's what's being targeted to actually know what to block and what not. This was used mostly on higher value websites that wanted to have an indefinite block, because DNS blocking is obviously easy to circumvent, and people have been changing their DNS servers in Venezuela for a long time, just because of the basically crummy servers set up by most ISPs in Venezuela, especially CanTV, the state-owned major player, and those people just change them just for better performance, even regardless of censorship. Social media streaming platforms tend to have this kind of blocking too, because they have large, like they work in large servers. Most of the servers share servers with other websites or other servers, and blocking by IP would have a lot of other impacts. This is usually also the case with higher value websites. So major mainstream websites, you wouldn't be able to just block an IP range, because if you try to do that, you'll take down a huge percentage of the internet, and it'll have huge political cost. YouTube usually was not targeted this way, and they usually tried to block YouTube with a TCP block of an IP range, but sometimes they did try to do HTTP blocking of YouTube for reasons unknown. And It's yeah, this is mostly used by CanTV. There's some exceptions, but it's as a common practice, is only by CanTV. And we can see some evolution here. So between 2013 and 2018, you see censorship moving from priority to priority. So changing priorities from publishing the black market exchange rates for US dollars in Venezuela, which we had currency exchange control and still have. News media on specific events, but especially protests, and a few large-scale network shutdowns, especially, for example, during a protest in 2014, for several days, a region of the country was disconnected from the internet because of very serious protest there. The government alleged it was somebody damaged the cable, but it's at the time it seemed that it was likely on purpose. And also, and this was confirmed during an election for 45 minutes or so, the Venezuelan government also shut down CanTV. They alleged that someone was trying to hack the National Election Council from outside of the country, and that's why they disconnected the whole country basically. But it's on them to explain that logic. On 2018, we see the start of this deep packet inspection-based blocking, such as TCP and HTTPS. Major mainstream news start to get targeted more fiercely, and we saw the block of Tor, in which they block both vanilla connections to Tor, and they block also most publicly known bridges. In 2019, we saw a dramatic increase of censorship to news, widespread use of SNI filtering, major internet platforms blocked, and the start of the tactical blocks that I mentioned before. By 2020, we are seeing blocking of opposition-led COVID-19 related initiatives, seemingly degraded deep packet inspection blocking capacity, which a huge asterisk will mention, and continuation of tactical blocks of major social media, new blocks to news media as well. So most of the sites that are blocked in Venezuela have a national audience. And even when they have an international audience, it's always because of the risk of this information affecting the public perception locally. So for news, for example, the international news websites blocked in Venezuela are blocked because they're usually in Spanish and have coverage of the Venezuelan situations framed in a way that might be interesting to Venezuelan audiences, or they're getting Venezuelan viewership, and that's why they try to block it. So you would see a one-time block of CNN because of the coverage of Venezuela, but only CNN in Spanish, not CNN in English. It's really rare to see international coverage in English of Venezuela being blocked in the internet, which is not the same as paid TV service, in which they usually take down even English language providers. In Venezuela, for example, right now, even cable operators can broadcast Deutsche Welle because of their coverage of Venezuela. We saw 12 news media websites blocked just in the first 3 months of 2019. Over 25 news media sites blocks that started on 2019, 4 new news websites being blocked in 2020, and severely limited access to information and news in general. So Venezuelan users have this general lack of access to news. It's really hard for them to access information, considering how radio is very seriously censored. And basically, just in a few very big cities, you have quasi-independent radio that's able to show political opinions freely, or roughly freely. I mean, they have a lot of caveats, and they restrict a lot of what they allow their guests to say, because they don't want to get sanctioned, and they have this risk ongoing all the time that if they say something that angers the telecommunications regulator, they'll get kicked out of their ways almost immediately. So there's no freedom really on radio. But on TV, it's even worse. There's just no attempt at having any kind of independence of any kind of TV operators that's trying to share the news. And print media is almost dead, not only because of technology, not only because of COVID-19, just because the government is not giving them press paper to the newspapers, and thus they can't print and they can't reach their audiences. It's a huge fight that journalists and news media are trying to hold on to their viewership and to their audience, because they can't reach them, especially with the current state of such a widespread internet censorship. I mean, even the actual livelihood of these news media operations is in jeopardy sometimes because of the reduced viewership, thus reduced ad sale, because since the website is blocked, only people from abroad or people using VPNs can access the websites. So people basically get their news from Twitter, but when they try to click to read more and get more information, I mean, nothing loads most of the time, and this is a huge problem. Most news media operations try to give best recommendations on which VPNs to use. We also recommend VPNs to users, and we also recommend techniques to make it to have different venues to get to their websites, so that people can set them up and still have some of their readership on the websites. Despite the internet censorship, it's not perfect, but it's a cat and mouse game forever. This kind of evading censors, and the censors then finding another way to screw you. We also see, for tactical blocks in 2019, we saw at least 64 tactical block events in 2019, of which 31 were for YouTube. Sometimes we saw YouTube block more than once in one day. On average, these tactical block events lasted 3 hours and 8 minutes. The shortest we saw was 20 minutes, and we saw this length multiple times during the year. And the longest was 24 hours. And this obviously, you start to hit the borders of this definition, which, well, by 24 hours, you might consider just a longer block over there. So we go back to this damage capacity for deep packet inspection-based blocks. So on April 6th, a fire disrupted a CanTV facility in Caracas. This facility includes a data center, and the battery room of this data center burned down. Just recently, an independent news website published a report on the terrible state of networking centers throughout the country, especially CanTV, due to lack of investment and maintenance. How most of them do not have adequate refrigeration. Most of them don't have air conditioning, and they have to resort to stuff like keeping doors open and putting huge fans just to have some air circulation so that things don't heat up. Eventually, this is what happened, and the battery room burned down, and the whole data center was offline for a long time. This even affected nationwide DHCP IP address allocation, and after DHCP address allocation was restored and most people had access to the internet again, basically all of the TCP and HTTPS blocking that we saw stopped. These include everything from news media to even porn websites. A lot of them were blocked in Venezuela. All kinds of websites that were blocked using deep packet inspection became released for this. Even tactical blocks that we assume that will not be pursued after this happened. Indeed, did not happen with the packet inspection, and they still tried to do tactical blocks, but in this time they tried to use DNS blocking, which obviously was not as effective, because if you try to condense the censorship to specific short time frame, and you want to be as effective as possible, you want to say from now on the blocking starts and then it ends. But if you have DNS blocking, it doesn't work that way, because if it's a common website, and I mean, when they do tactical blocks, it's just Twitter, Periscope, Instagram, YouTube, you probably already have a cache on your device of that IP address. Your device remembers the IP address from the last time it asked around for the address. So unless that cache expires, your device will not ask again for that IP address. And you won't, until that happens, is that you won't see this block happening. So you'll see a tail of people connecting to servers, to those services, and people start to complain and slowly increase during the tactical block implemented using DNS. So we weren't sure 100% that this was a limited capacity issue, but now it seems far more likely, because a tactical block using DNS is, I mean, it's just not very effective for what they want. So it indeed seems that that capacity was damaged or somehow limited. However, they still have some deep packet inspection capacities, and we'll mention them shortly. So around COVID-19 issues, we're seeing and saw these kinds of blocks. This is not the current snapshot. The current state is not like this, but this reflects basically the point where you see most censorship around COVID-19 issues. So you have different things. You have coronavirus Venezuela info, coronavirusvenezuela.info, which was blocked on most ISPs on request of the government. This is a site set up by Juan Guaidó, which is the president of the National Assembly, and it's in a dispute with Nicolás Maduro for who's the real president of Venezuela. And this conflict basically means that, yeah, they don't recognize each other, and some countries recognize Juan Guaidó and others Nicolás Maduro. Obviously, Nicolás Maduro is the one that have de facto control over the armed forces and most public institutions. And Coronavirus Venezuela Info was basically a domain set up just so that people could read information about the coronavirus in Venezuela, their spread, and how to prevent it, all set up by the Venezuelan opposition in the National Assembly. This was blocked on all major ISPs. Then some ISPs stopped censoring it. You also see Teleconsulta, which is a service where people would basically chat and respond questions, basically as a form, and get recommendations based on their risk factors and how likely it is that by their symptoms they have COVID-19. And that initiative was also blocked. There's some websites related to the presidency of Juan Guaidó that are also blocked. These websites are related to COVID-19, as some of these other initiatives require this server to actually work because they're hosted in the same server or as subdomains or have some other cross dependencies. And we also have Héroes de la Salud, which had their own server, had multiple, they pre-set up everything to have different domains. And this was an initiative to pay $100 as a financial aid to public health workers in Venezuela. So public health workers would register on Héroes de la Salud, prove that they are public health care workers, and ideally the Guaidó administration would provide them with $100 per month, which doesn't sound as a lot, especially for a doctor. But in Venezuela, I mean, the average minimum wage, the minimum wage in Venezuela is around it's around $4 per month. So you can see that $100 is a significant sum, even though it might not be a fair salary for a doctor anyways. But this initiative saw a lot of censorship, and they was setting up new domains every now and then, and they would also get blocked. It was a cat and mouse game that lasted throughout the initiative, throughout the time that people were registering to participate. On this website, we also saw a phishing attack we'll mention in the future. And the future came right now. The DNS manipulation and state-sponsored phishing will be represented basically by two cases. And these two cases are very similar and are definitely state-sponsored. And we'll see how we collected some information for them. The first one is Voluntarios por Venezuela, or Volunteers for Venezuela. It's a website where people would register to be a volunteer in the handling and logistics and so on of aid, basically humanitarian aid to Venezuela. This was in early 2019 when Juan Guaidó was at its peak of attention, international attention and so on. And basically the government set up a copycat website, a phishing website that was basically the same, had the same information, the same form. It looked almost exactly the same, but it had different URL. So you had malicious links pointing to it with voluntariovenezuela.com, which is a very similar domain. And you also had visits to the actual domain, voluntariosporvenezuela.com or voluntariosxvenezuela.com, that had poisoned or manipulated DNS responses. So you had malicious links shared on Twitter and social media, and even from specific dates. And what was happening is that when you ask for the IP address of that domain, you get the wrong address. So that you would get, instead to the actual domain that you wanted, you would go to a different one instead of the one that should have been. But what's interesting is that not only the state-owned ISP DNS server was giving you the wrong address, is that they had middle boxes using deep packet inspection, inspecting all DNS traffic and forging answers so that you would get to the wrong IP address. The actual response from stuff like the public Google public DNS or any other server you asked for, you still get it. But you'll get it after the fact you got the one from the middle box. And thus your computer will only take your first answer and ignore the second one, and you're always connected to the wrong server, even if you type the correct email address. This phishing attack was fuel for fake news, and the personal information of those phished was then published in a way to create fear and distrust, and also get them in trouble basically. And there was a exposure of over 5,000 victims on a website that I'm not giving the name. During this investigation, we found out previous phishing attacks to far many other domains, including Gmail, Twitter, Facebook, with copycat domain names using the local Venezuelan CCTLD. And this, for example, is what this same server looked at some point when requests got from accounts.gmail.web.ve. And what you saw is basically a login screen for Google. So it was definitely used for phishing in the past, for Google credentials. We gathered this information, especially the inconsistent DNS responses, using OONI mobile app. And that's what we used mostly as evidence of this inconsistent DNS response or manipulated DNS answers. And the capture of manual packages and the package capture of manual experiments is how we understood better what's going on. This attack lasted more. It was active 3 different times in 2 different servers, and both times it was taken down thanks to action by our team. The second one is Héroes de la Salud, the one we mentioned, the same about trying to help health workers during COVID-19. It worked pretty much the same. You have 2 different websites with 2 different URLs. See héroesdelasalud.info on one side, héroesdesalud.co on the other one. They looked exactly the same. The logic of the form was a little different so that you wouldn't see a lot of errors inputting information, so that even if you had errors, they could get as much information from you as possible. And there was some selective not blocking at CanTV so that you could get to the phished website easier. because some domains were just redirections to different domains. And with that selective not blocking, you would increase the chances that people would get to the phished website. So even the domain that was not being phished, didn't see this DNS injection attack, those domains were also part of the or victims of the phishing somehow. Because even if you typed the correct email URL for these alternative domains, you will get the legitimate 301 redirection. They redirect to the real domain, but when you ask for the IP address for that real domain, you get the wrong address, the same as the 2019 case, and thus you'll see the phishing website. And you also see this, of course, if you used HTTPS, you would see some kind of warning, and this warning, even though it's designed to be scary, most Venezuelan users are desensitized to heat because they're used to seeing it a lot. So for the longest time, Venezuelan students were used to seeing this when they try to register for new term in the universities, or when they try to pay for taxes or access some banks, because self-signed certification was very common in Venezuelan websites, especially government related. So people were used to seeing this, and they were just trained to automatically jump around the hoops, just whatever, just to get to the information they wanted. After this service was disabled, thanks again to action from our team, all other domains related to Héroes de la Salud became blocked again, despite being unblocked in the past, so that people wouldn't access it, because I mean everything was already set up. And we saw the same thing, exposure of personal details, very sensitive, even though the fake news out there is that that information was sold, was hacked, the website was insecure. I mean, the same MO as last time. We were able to confirm different times and different ways that the information exposed on these websites is the actual phishing website and not the real one, just the same as as 2019. In 2019, Digital Forensics Lab made a report on how they made sure that the information exposed on this website was actually the phishing website, and the information from the website and not the legitimate one. We did that in this instance with our own methods, and we captured information the same way with an addition of RIPE Atlas. We used RIPE Atlas this time to actually get some local vantage points with a different methodology and a more third-party way, so it's more independent. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Andrés, for a very interesting presentation on, I don't know, crazy stuff that's going on in the world of network interference in Venezuela. As you mentioned, I'll remind everybody that is listening in to this presentation on our live stream that you can leave your questions in the comment section or on the OONI Slack channel or IRC channel, and also on the pad that you see here on the screen. So we've already gotten some questions. I'll read you the first one, which comes from David F. And his question is, you mentioned that some blocks are not 100%. Is there any correlation between blocking rate and time of day, i.e. network load? In China, we have seen that some block destinations are more reachable during daytime hours. The hypothesis here is that censorship devices fail open under high load.
Yeah, we have the same hypothesis. Sometimes we have also hypothesized the possibility that some network routes are not covered by middle boxes capable of doing these kind of things. However, the most prevalent explanation for this is that indeed those devices fail open, and with these, we haven't been able to do a scientific analysis of this with the statistics, but anecdotally, it does seem that high network load of moments when a lot of people are connecting for some reason tend to decrease the block capacity of these network devices. We see them when they try to block a lot of things at the same time. So again, it will require more analysis, but it seems that when they try to do deep packet inspection-based blocking of multiple things, they might have a choking point there in the capacity of these devices to check for different things, even though one might expect that the main factor for this choking is the actual traffic, because you have to check every single package that comes through. And of course, if it would fail close, people would just complain that whatever they're doing online will be like it's not working, and yeah, it's not a good look.
So that's very interesting. I'll read a couple of comments as well that we got from the channel and IRC. Simone was mentioning the taxonomy with cases and events is very nice and useful, and some people followed up also agreeing with that. I also found that really cool and interesting way to look at.
I'll be happy to share more information of the taxonomy we use. I should be able to post something in about a week or two so that we can share like this is the taxonomy we use, why we think it's important to have this taxonomy this way, at least for us. And I think it's important to share at least the taxonomy we use, even if someone else doesn't want to take it. But we would love if some of this taxonomy would be adapted and be used more broadly, because we do have some limited capacity to briefly explain what's going on, because we don't have shared language for many of these things. And if that problem we see it in English, in Spanish is even worse. So it is important for me and our work to establish some clear taxonomies on our work.
Nice. Yeah, I think that would be very cool. I would find it useful. We have another question that comes again from David F. And the question is, you mentioned that users in Venezuela are desensitized to certificate security warnings. How aware are users of phishing threats? Are high-risk users, for example, journalists, more likely to be aware?
I would say they're more likely to be aware, especially in the last 4 years. We have seen some extremely high-profile cases of journalists, politicians, and NGO directors having their email exposed. Sometimes their email exposed and then modified. It's very scary. And at the time, we weren't sure what's the vector for some of these attacks. And it's not that we were helping individual cases, but in the community, it was like lack of knowledge of exactly what's the vector. Going back in time, we can see that these other phishing attacks that I mentioned, I don't know if I'm still sharing screen, but I'll post here the link of the image of the different URLs. You can see how many, like Twitter and Gmail and LinkedIn and Facebook are all there. So yeah, you can get some very high profile accounts this way, especially using traditional phishing techniques. I think they're increasingly aware, but people are still desensitized, and not everyone takes digital security as seriously as they should, in my opinion.
See, thanks for sharing that. We have another question that comes from Elos. Which would be the first steps to identify online censorship in countries in which these practices might not be obvious so far?
So I think the easiest way to get a leg up on this is having a community of people inside of the country that can have the mobile OONI app on their phones, and basically requesting them to run the test as frequently as possible. If, depending on your needs, you might have a specific list of of websites you want to test frequently. And in that case, it might be far more useful just to go to uni.io, run.uni.io, and paste that list there, and give them the link to the URL that run.uni.io gives you. That way, they can test against that specific list, and you have a more complete data set of a smaller list of websites. The other option that I recommend is that if you have some level of trust with them and they have a higher level of involvement in the campaign, ask them to at least nightly run the whole list, because this is a new function on the app, and you can run the whole list. It'll take a lot of time. In most phones, it will just put the phone in useless mode for hours, or at least an hour, while you try to run all the list, and you can't do most things with the phone at this time. So a good nighttime is a good moment to asking people to do that, and then analyze the results in Explorer. The thing is, all of this, having almost real time, or having a short window of time between everything is recorded and then you're talking about it, because that short window gives you the highest chance of having an impact locally, so that the block stops. At least in Venezuela, we saw this. If we reacted quickly with evidence that a block happened, we had higher chances of the block stopping, at least while the censorship thing was still nascent and it wasn't as institutionalized. That is harder using that perspective. Then you have to run to alternative ways of getting that information so that you can see the change faster. And I think in general, some tooling is needed to make this analysis of historic data for the websites you care about more easily seen. We're working on stuff like that, which once we finish, we'll share also.
And I would also add to that that additionally to all the great tips that Andrés mentioned with the OONI run links and everything, like us at OONI, we're always glad to help out people that are interested in starting some sort of research or internet measurement campaign to identify censorship in countries. So if you are, if you have some questions in terms of data analysis or in thinking about how to tackle a problem of identifying online censorship in your country, please do reach out to the team at OONI, and you can find like our email address on the website. So we're always happy to help out. I will remind you, you can leave questions in the link you see here on the screen. I have a question for you, actually, which is one that I've been asking several like projects that focus on looking at internet censorship in a particular country. And it's, we're here at the Internet Measurement Village. We have some great projects that are working on advancing the field of network measurement, and we're developing tools, methodologies, and all these great things. And I would just like to hear from you what if you have some specific requests or some wish list type features that you would like, that you're currently struggling in your work, that you wish the network measurement community could somehow help fill as gaps.
Yeah, so there are different things in my wish list. It includes stuff like having a way of identifying individual probes or individual devices that you're working with in a way that's not visible overall, but that you can, and with a special key or something, recognize which devices are which. Another really interesting thing would be to have a faster access to some measurements that pertain to your work. So even if it's not your own probe, perhaps it's like segmented in a way that's the country have, so they have a faster stream of this information. And we have been discussing this with correlation of the fast path. And another thing that would be, I think, really interesting is for people doing only run links-based campaigns, is to have some way of tracking how many people are clicking it and tracking the responses to that only run link. In our case, which I know is not the same use case as other people using only run links, is when we use only run, we want the answers fast. We want to know, like, if we're sharing, please try this out and see, give us the answer. We even ask for the JSON raw data to be sent to us as soon as the result is given. But that's very cumbersome in many ways. If there was a way of, like, see a stream of answers for a specific on a run link as they come in, it would be extremely powerful because it would help a lot in analyzing data. And that point about analyzing data is something that I want to emphasize, because we're not. They're both the scenarios are very possible. You can get false positives and false negatives, and many moments you had censorship and it was unclear for the probe, and moments where you didn't have censorship, but the OONI probe application says that you have censorship. So in my opinion, I think most times that you're going to go out and say that you saw censorship, for me, I think it's really important that you analyze the raw data at some point to make sure that it's indeed happening. And you should have a multidisciplinary team that includes someone who can understand this data, because otherwise you might come up with the wrong conclusions. And have seen that in many the work of many people in the community, sometimes when they don't see the need of including like technical understanding of the actual measurements, how they work, or how network it themselves works, so that sometimes they come up with the wrong conclusions of the same data because they're not analyzing data or they're not understanding it correctly. So I think one of the key points, if you want to start this kind of work, is reaching out to Arturo or Maria and getting in touch with them. Try to include someone in your team that actually understands network measurements or networking in general, and from there they can get really fast on understanding like what's being included in the actual data of an OONI report, so that you see what's going on. And I think it's really valuable also to understand the methods and the mechanics of the censorship, so that you can provide appropriate solutions to it, so that you can recommend both the blocked websites and the internet users that are trying to access those websites. You can give appropriate recommendations that are both safe and effective for both of them.
Yeah, those are some really excellent. That's some really excellent feedback, and yeah, thanks for sharing that. And as a matter of fact, on the OONI run thing, those are definitely are things that we're currently in the working on them. So be glad to hear about that. And yeah, the last point, I will definitely give a +1 to that. It's a very difficult line, that of balancing making the data easy to understand, but at the same time not misinterpretable. And I'll just reiterate that if you're in the process of making some sense of OONI data, and maybe you're not as deeply knowledgeable as Andrés and his team about how network measurements work, don't hesitate to contact the OONI team, and we're really happy to help out. We have a last question, which comes from Andrew W. And the question is, how can we as users that don't face these kinds of problems help out others? Probably the answer will be run a relay and, or if possible, an exit. But just wondering what you have to say.
Well, there are many things I think are important, and the tools that are possible for you, that make possible for users in restricted countries with restricted internet access. Sometimes these users don't have the economic means to pay for commercial VPNs. So what I would say the most is that helping out, providing economic support, or providing material support, if you can, any of those, so that solutions for citizens are more widely available. We also have this. This includes everything from VPNs to Tor bridges to any kind of stuff like this. Thankfully, quote unquote, Venezuelan internet access is very slow, as we mentioned. So even the free tier of some commercial tools, especially those that are trusted by the community, are really effective, because even the free tier is slow, but it's faster than most people have internet connections at home. So it's not as bandwidth intensive as it can be, but yeah, it still has millions of users who are potentially needing help. So consider that also. At the same time, helping spread the word when these kinds of incidents happen, especially those that are more easily marketable or more easily to engage with from the outside. So when you see a block of a major platform in a country, having a lot of noise outside of the country really shames the country and makes them change their value, their risk-benefit analysis of blocking major platforms, and thus make them try this less and less, or at least for less simple things, only when they really want it. And the less frequent we see internet blocks, the more freedom internet users will have, and that is very valuable also. It really helps a lot when Venezuela blocks a major platform and you see a very high noise around it. The Venezuelan government will not only tend to make that block shorter, will also be less willing to block again something that is major frequently or close behind, just so that the bad perception dissipates a little bit, because all governments have an audience inside of the country and an audience outside of the country. They want to maintain some level, even if it's minimal level of decent image with. And yeah, it really helps when you see news pieces or something going viral on social media about internet censorship in a country. I really believe that has an impact, especially when there's short windows. So if something just happened and it's being shared, if there's a lot of noise about it, then that is very effective.
Those are some really good points. Unfortunately, the time we had is over. I would like to thank you so much again, Andrés, for taking the time and sharing all your very valuable experience on measuring internet censorship in Venezuela and all the challenges that people face in accessing the internet there. And also, I would like to really thank you for the really important work that you and all your colleagues at VEsinFiltro are doing in monitoring internet censorship in Venezuela. It's really important work.
Thank you, Arturo.
I would also like to thank everybody who joined us today for the stream on the internet, that asked questions, that dropped by, and also the people that are joining this stream and looking at this video in the future. I will remind you that tomorrow we have another presentation at the same time on this same channel, and it's going to be from Philip Winter of the Tor project. And the topic will be circumventing internet censorship with Tor. So we'll see you all tomorrow here at 1400 UCC. Have a great evening or day or anything. Bye.